Learning Sicha about unity and separation. Essentially, what are we learning about? So the Sicha is about Kalayim, and Kalayim are the mixtures that individually they're permitted and together they're prohibited. This is a chok, we don't really understand it, even though despite everything that we're learning about it, we have a lot of explanation for these things, but ultimately we don't really understand it. Now, there's one thing, we went through the commentary, we didn't fully return to the law because we kind of set it as a sidebar, but the truth is, there's really something essential about the one commentary that we did that really speaks to a lot of what the Sicha is about. And that's the commentary that we had the Ramban about the abominations of the nations. That we said there's differentiation between what's considered an abomination and what the other things that we don't do. And the differentiation there is between things like sorcery and necromancy and sacrificing children to idolatry and things like that, versus people are just using divination to try to tell the future. And the point that's made there is that it's natural for someone to want to know what the future is. These other things go against nature. They go against the natural order that God has set up in the world. And that's why it's not just that God prohibits them, they're called an abomination. You're literally rebelling against, you're going against what God has set up for the natural order. That aligns with the whole idea of Kalayim, because we see also from Ramban and Rebbe that what's the idea of Kalayim? When you're trying to create new species, you're crossing the wires of creation. You're trying to create something new that wasn't there before. Now we might think is that something great, that's exemplary to try to create something new. But God didn't put us into creation for us to Frankenstein stuff. God put us into creation to perfect stuff, which is very different. We're not supposed to be just muddling around. The world is not a chem lab. The world is for us to perfect. So you have a through line, let's say, that God gave us wheat, that we chop down, we turn it into flour, and flour turn it to bread, and then we sustain ourselves with it, etc., in the kosher, halachic way, etc., etc., and then that's the way it's supposed to be. We're taking something and we're realizing the perfection of it. We're realizing what it could be. So we're taking the through line of ultimate betterment of it. Creating new creatures is not an ultimate betterment, it's a science experiment. God said, I have made stuff, I made each thing according to his kind, and that was intentional. So everything must remain according to his kind. And that's what God told the species from the outset. All species, God said, puravu, be fruitful and multiply, and as long as limineu, you reproduce after a kind, then you'll continue to exist as a species. That's humans, it's plants, it's animals, it's everything. Anything that can reproduce, it applies to all of it. That's why I see that animals, as a general idea, they don't crossbreed on their own. It's only human intervention. It's not just human intervention, it's human force that'll make them crossbreed. And that's part of why Rambam says this is a vulgar thing. What are you doing? But now when you look at the different kinds of kalayim, we see that there are different kinds of mixtures. And part of what are the difference between those mixtures is seen going back to the idea of an abomination. Kalayim, even though it's brought into that commentary, Ramban brings down kalayim, but we don't necessarily see the language. God doesn't say don't mix these things because it's an abomination, but we see that there's an underlying aspect that correlates to this idea of going against nature. Don't sow other seeds in your vineyard. Also in general, when you plant, each thing has to be planted according to its kind. And then that extends all the way to grafting. Don't graft. Because what do you do when you're grafting? You're trying to create something new. You're taking two things that are their own distinct entities and putting it together to create something new. Ramban tells us either you're not going to create something new because God says, no, that's not reproduction after its kind. That's not how I set nature up to be. Or if you're still going to force it and somehow, some way you're still going to get it, that new thing you created, it's not going to be able to reproduce, to sustain itself as a species that you'd only be able to keep getting if you keep grafting. The same thing applies to animals. Don't plow with an ox and donkey together. This really applies to all animals. You can't plow with any mixture of animals. It just says ox and donkey. These are the most common. Some of the commentaries say because it's going to lead you to stable them together. It leads to crossbreeding. So crossbreeding is a similar idea. You're taking two animals. For example, you could take the donkey and the horse. God made a donkey. God made a horse. They're each their own distinct entities, and you're trying to mash them together to create something new. Sure, you still get a mule out of it, but the mule does not reproduce. It's well known that mules do not reproduce because God has cut it. God says, no, I told you, don't be doing stuff like this. Both of those kinds of kalayim, you're trying to create something new, and we see the power of reproduction is cut off. So that's something essential is changed about that mixture. You're trying to change something in the natural order, and God says, no, we don't do that stuff. I'm not saying that's the full explanation of kalayim because God could make anything work anyway. But we see that that's part of what's going on with kalayim is we're not just like, oh, look what I made here. We're rebelling, quote unquote, against the natural order by trying to force things together that don't go. Now, those are two kinds of kalayim. The third kind of kalayim that we see mentioned is shatnez, which is a mixture of wool and linen. Shatnez, we know, is an acronym for the different ways that wool and linen can be combined on a thread level, but we see that it actually extends to any sort of way of combining them for any sort of garment or blanket or linens, things that you could put on yourself to warm yourself with. Now, the difference with shatnez is removed from the animal. The animal is not involved in it. So shatnez, you're not affecting the power of reproduction. There's not an essential thing that's going on there, and not just that, you could actually take it apart afterwards. Because the wool and linen kind of stay as wool and linen. You didn't specifically create something new. There's no name for the material that gets created from wool and linen together. You just say it's a blend of wool and linen. There's not a name for that because each thing is still its own thing. We haven't created something new out of it. So we see that there's exemptions for shatnez. For example, tzitzis, that's why it's the first one that's listed after those three separate verses. There's one verse that lists all the kalayim together, and there's another one that has them all listed separately. That's what we started the Sicha off with. In that, we see tzitzis is mentioned first. Why are these mitzvahs juxtaposed to tell us that there's an exemption for tzitzis? Not just that, we see there's another exemption. The Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim, but their belt that's called the Avnate was made out of shatnez. Now, we have to ask the question, if we're going against the works of creation by trying to combine these two elements, why can a Kohen in a Beis HaMikdash wear an avnei that's made out of shatnez. Because whatever's going on in the higher levels, the risks per se that are going on, the Beis HaMikdash overcomes that. So the power of the holiness of the Beis HaMikdash overcomes whatever would be, quote unquote, going wrong from putting these things together. So the wires that are being crossed are slightly different because it's not the essential mixture, not the same way as the reproduction. On the other hand, we are combining forces of good and evil, are getting tangled somehow with shatnez. How we don't understand, that's part of that, we don't understand it, but we know that that's what's happening. So in the Beis HaMikdash, the power of holiness subdues the power of evil. A Kohen in a Beis HaMikdash can wear an avnei without the risk of what comes from that mixture that's created. Tzitzis is such a powerful mitzvah that the same idea can happen there, that it's going to overcome whatever risk there would have been by combining it. That's not true with the other kinds of kalayim. So that's what we see for the first three kinds of kalayim. The fourth kind of kalayim, which we didn't think it was kalayim, is mixing meat and milk together. That we always thought was part of the rules of kashrus. Then we have the Kabbalists come and tell us, well, you know what? When you mix meat and milk together, it's not just, oh, I created this mixture. Up above, you're mixing forces. And when you mix justice with mercy, justice is going to dilute mercy because you mix them together. So justice is going to have an impact on mercy. It's not the same thing as when justice sometimes gets tempered by kindness. Kindness is already a higher level because everything leads toward kindness. Mercy is the middle. So you're going to have both of them within it. We don't want that to happen, so we don't mix meat and milk. Well, now they realize that meat and milk is not just cooking something together to create something new. We didn't just make a cheeseburger. I didn't just make chicken parmesan. I didn't just make that. Instead, now that I realize that the Torah prohibition is about cooking because that's where something new comes in, also, it's already removed from the animal. There's no power of reproduction that gets affected. So that's why I would think maybe it's much more like shatnez. I would think it's like shatnez because there's no power of reproduction. It's not an essential mixture in that kind of regard. Maybe like shatnez, where because it's not an essential mixture, the power of reproduction not being affected, that means in the Beis HaMikdash, I should be able to mix meat and milk together. That's where the question comes in. And instead we're told, no, God very specifically says don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. The Beis HaMikdash does not have an exemption for meat and milk. So there's something about meat and milk that puts it in the former category of the plants and the animals, because cooking it together creates something new that cannot be taken apart afterward. All that, we learned a lot of text about all this kind of stuff. Ultimately, what we came to, and this is kind of what we're wrapping up the mimer with, is, isn't it a good thing to try to make peace between things? The whole idea that you say, oh, we don't want kalayim to happen, we can't combine these things, but we have the whole Torah is about making peace. Here's part of what we learned last time. We'll get to this in a second. It's not just about making peace. Remember, those other kinds of kalayim are not just, let's create harmony between things. You are affecting the natural order of creation, which we see when people try to dabble in things that affect the natural order of creation. God calls this an abomination. He didn't say, oh, this is so nice that you made some harmony between things. He says, no, you're going against the natural order. By creating this new animal, this Frankenstein animal, even though we call it a mule, everybody knows a mule, but it's still a Frankenstein animal because you had to force that to happen. God says, I didn't want the mule. I wanted an ox, I wanted a horse, and I wanted a donkey. I didn't want this mule. Now you've created a new entity that we cannot find the horse and the donkey within it, in a general sense. That's not the same thing as with shatnez, that you mix it together and I can still take it apart afterwards. So it's not just about making peace. It's also about the fact that this is considered not natural to the order of creation that God has set into motion. God says there's a way the system is supposed to work, and you're supposed to complete the process of the system. You're not supposed to try to undo the system. That's where you have the differentiations in kalayim. And last time started addressing. We saw it in the text, but now we're just going to go through it in the text that make up that text of the mimer, and that will give us back the answer again. Difference between the different categories of kalayim, plants, and animals versus clothing is when mixing opposites, there are two potential outcomes. Number one, opposing and contradictory elements are nullified and they exist in peace. So how do I make peace between two opposites? Whatever makes them opposite, I have to take that away, I have to nullify that, and now everybody, see, now you're not opposite anymore, so now you can exist in peace. Second, the other way that you can mix things together is that each retains their state from before mixing, leading to conflict and discord. I'd say you two will go into that room and you'll not leave until you figure it out. But if they have no common ground or no anything, and they're just staying their own stubborn selves, then there's no peace between them. And not just that, there's going to be friction and discord and disharmony between them. Bringing two things together, there's two ways that can happen. Bringing two opposites together, specifically opposites. Either I take away what makes them different, and that way just everything's the same because now they have peace because they're all the same. Or if I want each thing to retain its status, its entity, because they're opposites, I can force them together, but it's not going to mesh. It's not going to happen. So plants and animals are mixed, quote unquote, with an intent to form something new and unique. Why do you crossbreed? Why do you graft? Because I want to create something new. This goes against Hashem's will because he specifically created them as separate entities, separate species, separate categories to serve their own purposes. The thing with the plants and the animals, remember, is more about the first one. That how do you get them to exist in peace when you mash them together and then you're going to force them into this new entity because you've taken away what separates them. As in, if I force a donkey and a horse together, the only way I can get a mule is if I take away the differentiations between the horse and the donkey. I created this mule, so it's not either one of these things. Now it's its own thing. Right? If I try to graft a fruit, as far as I know, nobody been into a nectarine. It was like, wow, this tastes like an apricot. Because I've taken away the apricotness of it, I've taken away the peachness of it, and I now have a nectarine. And same thing with anything else. That's all fine and good, but that's not what God wanted. He said, I made each thing for a reason. I want each thing to be its own thing. Everything that I've created has a specific purpose and goal. And what you're doing, you're trying to go and negate that. That's not what I set creation up to be. This is from Rabbi Menachem. You should not plow with an ox and a donkey together. The Torah uses the most likely pairing of an ox and donkey, one being much weaker than the other. This is the law for pairing any two animals of different species to pull a wagon. So it's not just plowing, it's mixing any two animals. The wise Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra, so that's a commentator, writes that the reason for this commandment is Hashem's concern and pity for his creatures, because the strength of a donkey cannot be compared to the strength of an ox. According to his words, it's specifically only about donkeys and oxen not being paired, not other animals, but this view is not that of our sages. Rabbi Bachya is bringing down another commentary who's called Ibn Ezra, or Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra, and he says Hashem is specific about the ox and the donkey. Don't plow them together because the ox is stronger than the donkey and he has pity on the poor donkey. True, but Rabbi Bachya, that's not the reason for it. It applies to all kinds of mixtures of animals. Now, explaining, the principal reason for this mitzvah is that pairing different species in such a fashion leads to their mating. So it's not just about who's stronger or weaker, it's because the result that comes from keeping these animals together all the time. For it's the way of a farmer to bring his team of animals to a common stable, which would facilitate mating and even giving birth to bastard animals, as in mutated animals. Obviously, the animals aren't married, so we don't mean that kind of bastard. We mean like a bastardized version of an animal, which contradicts the works of creation, which we saw. That's why that kind of animal is not allowed on the altar. You're not allowed to bring that kind of animal as a sacrifice. What is this? What is this animal? Of which it says, lemina, lemineu, which is after its kind, i.e. reproducing after their own kind. And what strengthens this reasoning is that it's placed between two verses about kalayim, i.e. maintaining the purity of species, the verse before about sowing different seeds in your field, and the subsequent prohibition of shadis. As in, he's saying the crossbreeding of animals is put there right in the middle with all the other kalayim to show that this is what it's about. It's not just about one being stronger or weaker than the other. The whole idea of the kalayim, they're not supposed to be bastardizing, creating mutations, Frankensteining God's stuff. Now, what about when we talked about, we go on and on about Oseh Shalom. Remember, we brought that up last time. Oseh Shalom, we go on and on about God brings peace between Malch Michal and Malch Gabriel, between fire and ice. We have so many great things. This is such a wonderful thing that God does. How come for them it's not considered kilayim to mix kindness and strength? That should be kilayim. Why all of a sudden this we're praising? In contrast, Oseh Shalom, Michal and Gabriel are nullified before Hashem, but maintain their respective roles as Hashem desired. Each retains his individual identity without extinguishing the other. So what is so unique about when we talk about Oseh Shalom, we talk about Malch Michal and Malch Gabriel, these two angels, because sure, they set aside what would make them oppose each other, but not because they've gotten rid of it, but because they have become nothing before God, the higher entity, but they are still the angel of water, the angel of ice, and the angel of fire. So I don't undo myself to submit myself. I don't undo the way God has made me. I am still me that have now submitted myself over to God. We talk about making ourselves nothing, but we mean it in the sense of an ego sense, not in the sense of distinctive properties that God has given you sense. That's very different, because I have been made for a very specific purpose. The difference is that I've removed the I from my purpose, as in it's not about whatever I think my purpose is, it's what God says my purpose is. But the purpose that God has given is tailored to me as He's created me as an entity. I submit to Him, but I recognize this submission is because you have made me to be the officer of fire. So what do you want this entity called officer of fire to do? I've not taken away the fact that it is officer of fire. When you create new species, you have to take away what it is in order to create something new. So the thing that's distinct about Oseh Shalom is that we don't take away what makes them distinct. What we've done is actually channeled it in a way to say you are both here to serve God, but you have to recognize that you each have your part to play within it. So you maintain your identity, but without discord, without extinguishing each other, and with total submission to God who's above all of us. That's the difference. So you see, it's not like either kind of the Kalayim, because they stay who they are, but somehow they also don't extinguish the other. With shatnez, because the wool and linen remain as they were even after mixing, which we know that because we could take it apart. Oh, look, they didn't create a new species with wool and linen. Why should shatnez be prohibited? You could take it apart afterwards. Well, yeah, that's the point. The fact that you could take it apart afterwards means that there's not real peace between these two entities because they haven't blended, they haven't mixed together. Number one, the higher powers, attributes they symbolize, chesed and gevurah, are opposing faculties. In this world, their nullification is not openly visible, so combining them mixes different species, and also holiness with sitra achar, the other side. Such a combination has an inverse outcome of conflict and discord. Down here in this world, because we can't see how Chesed and Gevurah have submitted, Malch Michal and Malch Gabriel, we don't see the submission at play because that's not visible in this world. What you're doing instead is you're crossbreeding, essentially. You're mixing up these attributes, and we know that because they've maintained themselves as entities to the extent that you could separate it afterward. So that's part of the answer, first of all, just in general about Kalayim. But now again, we still want to know what makes shatnez, because now we see that shatnez is conflict and discord. We saw the extended version of that with Cain and Abel, that their their quote unquote their shadness, and we see that they can't mix. In all their reincarnations, we see these are souls, they're always opposed to each other. In this world, that's how it goes. Cain and Abel, that was fatal consequences. Moshe and Korach, well, Korach dies after his rebellion against Moshe. So we see that somehow it doesn't translate into this world. That's part of what the issue is. But again, so how come there's an exemption? So that's what we get over here. What section 8 is going to tell us. So we'll see just these couple of boxes, and then we'll do the text. All considered, so consider everything that we've learned. Kalayim is allowed for tzitzis and the service of the Beis HaMikdash, because in a matter of mitzvah and holiness, the combined opposites don't fall into conflict and strife, but exist in peace and unity. There's something different about things of holiness, of kedusha. Remember, we said the Beis HaMikdash and the tzitzis, because these are things that are wholly submitted to God. So where there is whole submission to God, there's no sense of ego. Where there's no sense of ego, there's no option for clashing. But that's without undoing ourselves, as in without undoing the distinctness that God has created us with. However, where kalayim causes discord, which is not relevant in regard to mitzvah, there's not discord within the mitzvah that God has commanded us. The mitzvah itself is God's will, so it's a perfect entity. But in mixtures which disrupt the natural order and undermine the system of creation, each according to its kind, be it holy or mundane matters, it's forbidden to override the borders guidelines Hashem set for the world. So what's the problem when it comes to kalayim? Because we live in a physical world, and this physical world that we live in right now, we cannot achieve the kind of peace and harmony of opposites that exist up in the higher realms that God could achieve with Mach Machal and Mach Gavril. It doesn't work in this world. We already said that, because why? In this world, everything is very distinct. Everything has its very specific time, place, etc., form, entity. And two things in the physical world, they can't live on top of each other. They can't exist in the same space. So in this world, when things are not opposing, then you can make a Moshe out of it. But where things are opposing, it's the wrong ends of the magnet, you can't create unity out of that. There's discord and disharmony. Thereby, because of that, God has set rules for creation. You have to follow them. We can't try to rebel against it or try to undo those works of creation, because it leads to disharmony and discord. Therefore, for animals and agriculture, there's not even a doubt that kalayim would be allowed for holy purposes. The question that we had about the Beis HaMikdash, for example, or the other mitzvos came in regard, well, shanis, because we saw the exemptions, and meat and milk. We didn't ask that question about plants and animals, because knowing what we know now, we know from the outset that it can't be allowed. Why is it not allowed? Because it goes against the works of creation. You can't take something that rebels against God's system and say, hey, look, I'm going to go make it holy now. No, what we can do is matters of holiness, things that oppose each other, you can make a harmony between them. That's literally what only holiness can achieve, a perfect harmony between things that oppose each other, without them having to give up their distinct selves, their distinct creations. There could be doubt for mixtures of meat and milk, which may be considered like shatnez. Well, maybe meat and milk is more like a shatnez thing, because I didn't create like a new species out of it. However, cooking them together results in a new entity. Just like animal species, it's forbidden to mix them or to use them for karbanos, sacrifices. Meat and milk we think would be like shatnez, but because something new is created, and this is this new entity that God says no, then it falls into the other kind of categories, which means that their mixture, the mixture of meat and milk, is something that does not harmonize with the intent of creation. It cannot be sublimated to that. Thereby, it's part of the other part of kalayim category, which is just an absolute no. We cannot find any exemption for it. Shatnez, we're talking about opposing forces. We're saying in the higher realms, God can make peace of the opposing forces, which means that wherever there's a reflection of that higher realm, and that what God could accomplish up there, down here, that means it can be achieved here. For example, the Beis HaMikdash, that's a place that's a totally holy place. The mitzvah itself of tzitzis is totally holy. That can be reflected down here. But other things, us trying to combine them, I'm just making a shirt out of wool and linen, I can't achieve what God can achieve. The whole thing of kalayim comes into play again with shatnez, because no, you cannot create this harmony between these opposing factions, because it's something mundane, not something holy, where things get sublimated over to God. This is the difference between the kinds of kalayim. Now we can read the text for section 8, and then after that it's just section 9, which is going to refocus on meat and milk. We're going to have a lot of stuff about meat and milk. All right, the text. Ches, section 8. According to all that we've said, all that we've mentioned above, we can now explain also the three categories that have been mentioned in section 2 as they relate to the Beis HaMikdash, as in how do the kalayim relate to the exemption/non-exemption of the Beis HaMikdash. Tama heter de kalayim betzitzis, b'chein b'shaychus la'avodas HaMikdash, hu lefi shebe'inyan shemitzah kedusha midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu nasa al yedei irbuv shnei hafachim lo pir machlokes el adrabah shalom v'achdus kanal barucha. The reason for the permission, as in for the exemption of kalayim when it comes to tzitzis, and also in relation to the service of the Beis HaMikdash. Why is shatnez allowed when it comes to tzitzis and the avnate, the service of the Beis HaMikdash? Because when it comes to a mitzvah and things that are kaddish, holy, sanctified, which is the attribute of the Holy One, blessed be, this is God's domain. Obviously everything is, but this is specifically unto God, all that is submitted unto God. When a mixture is made of these two opposites, it doesn't lead to conflict and discord. Rather, instead, it's going to bring about peace and unity, as we've discussed above at length. That's the whole section that we saw, 2 sections above, where it spoke about Mach, Machal, and Gavril, and Osa Shalom, etc. Because specifically in what is holy, there could be submissiveness without losing the distinct qualities that make up each entity. It could be without ego, without losing distinctness. The categories of kalayim, that their mixtures lead to separation and conflict, So what is lacking there is that this is not related in any way to a mitzvah and to kedusha and to holiness, to sanctity. The whole thing about why does shatnez specifically work in tzitzis and the Beis Hamikdash is because there you can have the unity, which each thing retaining its own distinctness without it nullifying each other. But the harmony is created because holiness, mitzvahs, Hashem creates the harmony. Versus in mundane matters, we don't get that kind of harmony because two things can't exist in the same place. The opposites cannot coexist. Even if you try to force it together for a while, it's not going to stay. It's not going to last like that. However, the kinds of kalayim that the mixture is going to nullify what separates them, that separates according to its kind, a sidra habriya, which is the order of creation. Here it doesn't even matter whether it's something that's holy or not. Something like a mixture, they retain their own selves and there's conflict between them. That's something that holiness can bring into harmony between them. So that's why it can be permitted, the Beis Hamikdash, when it comes to tzitzis. However, the mixtures where you have to nullify the distinctness in order to create a new entity, so you mush it together so it blends together and now you have something new, doesn't matter if it's holy or not holy. What matters is that you have now gone against the order of creation. And going against the order of creation, Beis Hamikdash, not Beis Hamikdash, mitzvah, not mitzvah, none of it, because you can't go against the order of creation. God has made everything specific to its kind. God wanted everything to be its own distinct thing. God doesn't want us to create blends that nullify what separates each thing. So it's in between making a salad and a smoothie kind of idea. So in any way, again, whether it's holy or not holy, whether it's a mitzvah or not, it is forbidden to nullify the borders that Hashem set into place. As in, what is the distinction between these two kinds of kalayim? It's not just about the discord and the conflict. One, at least they retain their identities. The other one, they don't. And because they don't retain their identities, you Frankenstein something new out of them, but now you've gone against the order of creation that God said each thing is going to be something specific. Therefore, when it comes to the mixtures, the kalayim of behema, of animals, and the kalayim of agriculture, basically, there's not even a doubt. It doesn't even arise in your mind. There's not even an option to permit them for holiness. Remember, when we introduced meat and milk, we said, we have a question of which way does this go? Do we have an exemption or we don't? We didn't have that same question when it came to animals and plants. Because when it comes to animals and plants, they would know automatically it's not permitted at all. And we know that because it goes against the workings of creation. So we know it doesn't matter mitzvah or not, that's not going to save the situation over here. It's not going to save what comes about by trying to force these two together. But dafka basar b'chalav, specifically basar b'chalav, meat and milk, that's where we have the question. Sheish makam lemer sheshach l'sug deklai begadim kanal siv dalid. Specifically meat and milk, that there is a place that we say, maybe it's kind of like kalai begadim. It's kind of like the mixture of clothing that we saw above, as we mentioned above when it comes to section 4. So that's where we first brought it in. So there, meat and milk, we're like, hey, maybe it's more like shanis because we're not doing this essential mixture. We're not going against the workings of creation with this. Doesn't seem to be. We're not affecting reproduction or anything like that. So there, it might arise in our mind. We might have a doubt that maybe we could permit it when it comes to holy things, like with shatnez in the clothing of the kohanim. But according to what the Torah tells us very specifically, based on in the house of Hashem, the house of Avaya Kecha, Los Vashad Gedi, etc. Don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. The Malchashar get the Basa B'chalav Hu Canal Yitzias Mitzias Chadasha. That after the category of meat and milk, the boundaries of meat and milk, we see that it's actually creating something new. Sure, you don't affect the powers of reproduction. However, it creates something new, and creating something new is not what we're about. We're about perfecting what God has given us, seeing the through line down to the finish, but not about starting to create new entities. Thereby, because mixing meat and milk, because cooking them together creates something new, thereby becomes similar to the category of kilayim of animals, of mixing these animals. In this kind of way of making a mixture, it's forbidden even when it comes to things of holiness, in matters of kedusha and sanctity, as we mentioned above. So meat and milk was the only one we had a question on. Shatnez, we said, how could we have an exemption for? Because it's about forcing two opposites together. In mundane matters, we cannot create peace and harmony between them. However, in matters of holiness, and when it comes to Torah mitzvos, when it comes to the Beis Hamikdash, for example, their harmony can be created between opposing factions because they don't lose their identities, they don't lose their distinctness. Shatnez, you could take it apart afterwards because wool and linen remain unto themselves. There, when it comes to matters of holiness, we can sublimate it. We could create harmony. However, mundane matters, there's not the power to do that. That's why ultimately it becomes prohibited in regular everyday things because we can't conquer the opposition then. However, holiness can. Now, when it comes to mixtures of plants and animals, it's not even about opposing factors because there you nullify what separates things and you create peace and harmony so they're not different anymore. However, what you did is you made them not different anymore. You took away their distinctness. And because you do that, you're undoing the works of creation, which Hashem says everything after its own kind. God is very specific in what he did. If you ever dealt with kids, you're like, oh, look what I made. And you're like, that's nice, but that's not what your job was laws right now. God is very specific for each thing to be its own entity, to be its own thing. God very specifically made everything and everyone distinct. And the point is to be able to find harmony between distinctness, not to undo the distinctness. So that's why when it comes to plants and animals, we don't even question, oh, can holiness undo this? Mitzvah can undo this? It's not even a question because it goes against the works of creation. It's a totally different approach to this. There's something else that's going on here. Now, when it comes to meat and milk, we have a question. Which way does it go? Because on the one hand, we're not affecting something essential. We're not affecting the powers of reproduction. We're not going against the works of creation in that regard. So maybe it's more like clothing. However, because we are creating something new, cooking it together creates a new entity whereby you can no longer separate the two. And because of that, it ends up falling into the categories of things that go against the works of creation. And that's why in matters of holiness, it can't be permitted.